Hello everybody, welcome to a comprehensive look at the 1.0 version of Dark Souls 2. Specifically the original vanilla release from 2014, not the Scholar of the First Sin, as that is a different version of the game entirely. We are currently working backwards through the Dark Souls trilogy, meaning we have already taken a look at Dark Souls 3, with the original Dark Souls 1 game video likely coming within a month. But we've also reviewed Elden Ring, Demon Souls Remake, Bloodborne, and Night Rain. The goal of the video will be to show everything that's been changed between the original print of the game versus what's in the current patched game now. These videos exclude DLCs, as it's not content that's available yet in the 1.0 versions. If you're unaware, a 1.0 version of a game in today's context is the version of the game that's printed into the discs that were shipped to stores. And you can play this version by installing the disc straight into the console without downloading whatever online updates are available for the game, assuming it's not a later retail version of the game that has the DLC patches already in the disc. For instance, the Scholar of the First Sin PlayStation 3 edition, which is the same version in this case, I know, that's confusing, I'll explain in a sec, might not have the true 1.0 version if it has the DLCs and later updates in the disc. Okay, so, just so we're all on the same page, Dark Souls 2 originally released mid-March 2014 for PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, this being the version we're discussing today, with a PC release a month later. Updates and the 3 DLCs released periodically over the rest of the year, then by April 2015, a pack compiling the DLCs was released for PS3 and 360 called Scholar of the First Sin. However, this is not to be confused with the PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and PC version of Scholar of the First Sin, which is an altered version of the game that famously, or infamously, depending on who you ask, changed loads of enemy placements, added pursuer encounters that mimicked invasions, etc. etc. This is definitely confusing, but I hope the visual edits help with clarity. Again, it's the original PS3 version from 2014 that we're looking at today, not any of the Scholar versions. That could be a video in the future, depending if there are noteworthy changes between the patches. I will need to research more to be certain. This actually leads to a funny, but also kinda not funny incident when it came to starting this project. This is the first game in this series that I had to whip out my PlayStation 3 for, and it turns out its Wi-Fi/Bluetooth module is broken. That means that even with an Ethernet cable, the PS3 can't update to the latest system software, and attempting to do so bricks your PS3. Which I did do. I did eventually figure out how to restore it, but unfortunately it seems that I can't update it to access the internet anymore, unless I fix or replace the module. This doesn't affect the 1.0 version install in any way, so that's still good to go, but usually how I make these videos is that I do an entire playthrough 1.0, record all of it, and write down any discrepancies I think I've noticed with timestamps. Then usually I use the same disk and update to the current patch and do a separate playthrough on another profile so I can still access the original 1.0 file by downpatching later, and then verify the suspected changes. Since I can't access the current patch from this console anymore, I was in a bit of a pickle. I do own other versions of the game, but they're all the overhauled Scholar Edition. At first I thought my options were either to get another PS3 with a functioning module, or fixing it, or to get the PS3 Scholar version, the one that's still technically the same game, and hope it already had the latest patch installed. But this was all because I was under the impression that the Steam version of the vanilla Dark Souls 2 was completely delisted, like Dark Souls 1 Prepare to Die edition. But it turns out you can buy it still, but only with the bundle that includes the DLCs, for some reason. So that's $40 for the extra DLCs I don't need for this video. Yay for tax write-offs, I guess. But as a result, I ended up going through the process a bit differently, where I could do an area or two in the PS3 1.0 version, then quickly pivot to verify the changes I suspected on the Steam current patch version, which is handy for Dark Souls 2 specifically, because not only is it the game I'm least familiar with, so it's best to check things as fast as possible, but also because I haven't played the vanilla version of this game since like 2015, having eventually bought the PS4 Scholar Edition and defaulting to that, since it already included the DLCs. So for me, it's good to have it fresh in my noggin and not get my wires crossed with the overhauled Scholar Edition. Anyway, for resources I used to help me research outside of my own game knowledge, I did heavily rely on the Dark Souls 2 Future Press guide for the original game as a cross-reference, especially when it comes to item locations via the maps they have, to make sure I don't miss any little minute detail of the level. I did occasionally refer to the several wikis there are for the game, but to a lesser degree. There are a handful of videos and playthroughs out there on YouTube already going through the 1.0 versions, but I haven't watched them personally, just for full disclosure. When I'm showing footage of changes present in the 1.0 version that differ from what is currently available through updates, I will have a label saying 1.00 in the top right corner of the video, and when showing footage of the current patch, which would be 1.12, the last update Dark Souls 2 had for DX9 at least, there will be a current label in the top right corner as well. The image quality and frame rate will also be an easy tell which version we're looking at currently. If I skip through something that you're wondering about, like a major boss or something, it just means I didn't find any differences, so I didn't mention it. You're welcome to comment about any particular thing you're curious about, of course. Finally, like I said, Dark Souls 2 is the game I'm least familiar with in the series, so if there's any game where I'm likely to miss something, it'd be this one. But my goal for these videos is for y'all to be able to contribute with any additional knowledge in the comments as well. That way we can have a complete picture of the changes in the whole package, even if I miss things in the video itself. So let me know if I missed anything, and I will put it in the pinned comment once I verify it. Alright, that should be all. Let's get into it. As stated already, DLCs are inherently not finished by the release of disc versions of each game, so naturally you don't receive the keys when you finish creating your character in 1.0. If you didn't know, in the vanilla version of Dark Souls 2, you are simply given the keys that open the doorways into the DLCs, instead of having to find them in the world like in the overhauled Scholar versions. There's a chance this is simply a console bug or something of the sort, but it was replicable for me when testing it multiple times. So I'll mention that although the hairstyle you choose in the character remains the same, the hair color doesn't properly update in 1.0 until you reload the area, say by dying. Obviously this applies properly in current patch. When you use the gender changing coffin, there's no prompt after climbing back out in 1.0, where in current patch it says the nature of your being has changed. Given there's many players who didn't realize what this did to their characters on first playthroughs, including myself, it makes sense to add a signifier that something happened, but it is vague enough that it may not have tipped off some players as to what changed. From here, there wasn't anything to discuss in Majula, so over in the Forest of the Fallen Giants. In 1.0, Merchant Hag Melintia doesn't sell bright bugs like she does in current patch. Ever. As a matter of fact, I hadn't realized until I was writing this that I never got a bright bug in this version of the game. And it does turn out they were added with the DLCs. In Overhauled Scholar, they do add like one in Lost Bastille and another in Aldia's Keep, but neither were there for vanilla, even in current patch. One thing I noticed, and that makes sense for balancing purposes, is that a lot of weapons had their stat scaling, and on rare occasion even stat requirements, changed at some point during the game's lifecycle. What this means for each individual weapon, I don't know. It could just be player facing and not actually change the damage, but I'm sure there was a history of nerfs and buffs in the community. I also didn't find every single weapon in the game, so I won't be showcasing all of them, but I will be detailing all the ones I have and noticed in the order of where they are found in-game. The first one is the hand axe. In 1.0, it had a D scaling in strength, where that's changed to C scaling at some point. Identically, the blacksmith hammer went from D strength scaling to C as well. I didn't find any difference with Last Giant, so I'm skipping over it for the Pursuer, where I noticed that the ballista does nearly the entirety of the health bar. It does loads of damage in current patch as well, but I would estimate it's closer to 85%, where in 1.0 it was like 95%. It's very noticeable. The Drown Lake sword you can find after the fight got a buff too, going from B strength scaling to A. In a similar vein to the weapons, some spells had their properties changed. The main changes I found, on paper, were related to how many uses some spells have individually, but I did find at least one example of the attunement slots required changing. I was able to collect nearly every spell in the game, but unfortunately, there are a handful locked behind Covenant rewards and such that would be possibly outright impossible without access to online play, but otherwise just too time consuming for one item. Despite this, however, I didn't find any stat requirement changes in the 95% of the spells I collected. There wasn't any changes in Heights Tower Flame itself, so I just go straight to discussing the miracles that were affected from Lycia's catalog. The first one is Caressing Prayer, which went from having 4 uses in 1.0 to 8 at some point after X patch, no doubt to encourage usage. The only other one from her catalog was Lightning Spear, which devastatingly went from 10 uses 1.0 to just 3. This actually leads to another major note. I don't know much about the history of Dark Souls 2's balance patches, but one thing I have heard over the years was how much miracles specifically were nerfed to the ground. I do believe most or all spellcasting types receive some debuffs, but from my understanding, miracles were the most severe, with maybe hexes being the only one that still felt fairly viable after all the patches. And that's coming from someone who's tried a few of the spellcasters in the past, where I would say hexes and pyromancies were still viable and fun, and sorceries felt very weak for how much investment you dedicated to them. So I can't even imagine how bad offensive miracle builds must be that you play the game now in the latest patch from all these stories. Perhaps miracles specifically were quite overpowered, although after planning my character to be a miracle caster for 1.0, because of all the whispers of this, I don't think they were overtly broken from my experience, though I'm mostly stuck with lightning spears and emit force. I'll be relying on the comments here to paint a clearer picture of why and how miracles were neutered so harshly, but even outside of the spell charges decrease, here's some side-by-side comparisons of the damage with both characters having exactly 22 faith to wield lightning spear and having a +2 of the same chime. And reminder, I have 7 more casts in 1.0, where it's already visibly so much more powerful. For the Old Knight halberd you find shortly after Hides in the corridor to No Man's Wharf, it went from an E in strength and B in dex scaling to C and A respectively. I also didn't find changes in No Man's Wharf itself, but when looking at Carhelian's stock, I noticed Great Soul Arrow went from 10 uses to 15, which in theory should be a buff, but I don't know how the damage numbers specifically look. I wouldn't be surprised if the trade-off isn't worth it. Similarly, Great Heavy Soul Arrow went from 8 uses in 1.0 to 10. Over in Lost Bastille, there's actually a handful of changes. Firstly, the Craftsman's Hammer that's under Macduff's chest goes from C strength scaling to B. This area is where we get our first invader NPC, and this is how I found out that none of the invaders in this game drop anything, where in current patch, they're at least guaranteed to drop a single human effigy. I believe I read that they have other optional drop loot tables, but I never got any in either version personally. When talking to Strayed, I noticed that some of his subtitles were ordered a little bit wrong.
Very good. Very good indeed.
It seems that it was indeed an error because it was fixed at some point to match the voice acting better.
Very good. Very good indeed.
Strayed doesn't sell the Agape Ring in 1.0, and I did read that this got added in a specific patch later on, specifically 1.10. It's the one that allows you to keep your soul count and soul memory static. So no doubt this was added after some feedback from people wanting some way to stay at a certain invasion and summoning range. Strayed sells Cast Light, which originally had 4 uses, but got increased to 8, probably for the same reason as Cursing Prayer. He also sells Unveil, which went from 4 uses to 8, but this was also the only spell with an attunement slot number change, going from 2 slots needed to 1, probably also for added utility and encouragement to use the spell. And now looking at his currently available tradable boss soul items, we get our first stat requirement change as the Gargoyles Bident from the Belfry Gargoyles went from needing 15 strength and 25 dex to 22 and 15 respectively. They almost just flipped the numbers, so perhaps this was a typo of some sort, but they reduced that strength number requirement a bit, if that is the case. Okay, so unfortunately, we only have spell and weapon changes for Huntsman's Copse, Harvest Valley, Earthen Peak, and most of Iron Keep. I didn't notice any differences in the level or bosses themselves, so I'll just speed run through these. Great Resonant Soul goes from 8 uses in 1.0 to 4 in current. Full Moon Sickle goes from E strength scaling to D. Notch Whip goes from B dex scaling to A. Emit Force goes from 8 uses to 4. Heavenly Thunder goes from 4 uses to 5. Soul of Peace goes from 4 uses to 2. The Normal Whip goes from B dex scaling to A. Bone Scythe goes from B strength scaling to A. Pike goes from C dex scaling to B. Black Knight Great Axe goes from 10th intelligence requirement to 8. Wing Spear goes from C dex scaling to B. And lastly for this streak, Black Knight Greatsword goes from 12th int requirement to 8 as well. Right at the end of the Iron Keep, the only change I found was that in this room, with the portal past the Primal Bonfire that's available in current patch, which leads to the old Iron King DLC, straight up isn't there in 1.0. Something you may have noticed if you played the game before the DLC released, but may not have known otherwise. Over in the Black Gulch, the Chateau goes from E strength and C dex scaling to D and A respectively. Similarly to the Iron Keep, the cave after the Rotten is lacking the light and portal in the back. It actually appears significantly smaller and pretty mundane, outside of having the Primal Bonfire. Over in the Shaded Woods, I was able to get a line of dialogue from Man-Scorpion Tark that was missing entirely in current patch.
Since I speak the tongue of men, Does this mean I was once human?
I tried to replicate the exact sequence of events when going through both versions of the games, so I'm decently confident they might have just cut this line, as it doesn't show up in the wikis either. Although it's not out of the question that it could be a bug. It seems to have some lore implications, so it could have been a conscious choice, but who knows. Unfortunately, we have another streak of minor weapon and spell changes again, mostly due to artifacts. So quickly here, Twisted Barricade goes from 2 uses to 20, quite a stark increase there, probably since it's a utility spell. Perseverance goes from 4 uses to 8, Partisan goes from 20 dex scaling to S, Butcher Knife goes from E strength scaling to A, quite a big jump too, maybe because it's a balsa weapon and they wanted it to give it more significance. Iron King Hammer goes from D strength scaling to C, and Soul Shower goes from 4 uses to 5. Finally, for the main Old Soul bosses thing, Aldia doesn't spawn in the 1.0 version, where if you have killed all the old Lower Soul bosses up until now, and touched the Primal Bonfires, he'll spawn in the Primal Bonfire of the 4th one you killed in current patch. The reason he doesn't in 1.0 is because Aldia was only added after all the DLCs came out. He just didn't even exist when the 2nd came out, so that also means he's not a potential ending boss. The fountain in the Shrine of Winters that leads to the Ivory King DLC is there already this time, but it doesn't have any glow to it and stuff, and you can't interact with it, making it clear it's not active. The only change I found in Dragon Lake Castle is that Soul Bolt goes from 2 uses to 3, and Profound Still goes from 2 uses to 1. Over in Shrine of Amana, the Red Iron Twin Blade goes from C strength scaling to B. I didn't find any changes in this area besides that, but rest assured, I had a terrible time. In the Beninging of the Undead Crypts, we finally have a quite significant change here. The bonfire in 1.0 is hidden below the stairs here, whereas in current patch, and in overhauled Scholar version even, it's moved to the front of the stairway, plain in sight. This probably had a double purpose, the level design reason being so people are less likely to miss it. I could definitely see loads of people missing it, and it's quite an elevator ride to go from the last one in Shrine of Mana, but the second purpose is that Aldia spawns here when you meet all requirements so far. I just skipped talking to them in current patch since I didn't really need them. The only other detail here is that the Great Lightning Spear goes from 8 uses to 2, another devastating reduction. So obviously we still have a bit to go in terms of game progression, but it did start the Novlan Assassination questline, so I needed to do the map guy's fire lighting, meaning I had to get a head start with the ending bosses. This led me to find out that the Throne Watcher and Defender don't count as the 8th and final candle lighting in the map for 1.0. And I only found out way later that Ashandra is the one that does it, when in current patch it was the Throne bosses. I suspect they changed it so you don't literally have to beat the game to complete this questline, or kill Kale, so just a convenience thing I suspect. From the Ancient Dragon Soul, the Curved Dragon Greatsword goes from C strength scaling to B. Now firmly in the in-game territory, from the Giant Lord's Soul, Rappel goes from 4 uses to 15, another significant increase. Even after acquiring the Ashen Mist Heart, you cannot examine Vendrick's armor to talk to human Vendrick in 1.0, as that was also added in the first DLC, adding the whole Crown's questline thing. And now after killing Nashandra, naturally Aldia can't show up because you can't clear DLCs in 1.0, and he doesn't exist, but one detail they did add is a light showing you the way to the throne, despite not having access to the other ending, as they don't do this in 1.0 at all. The room just stays the same. I imagine it wasn't quite necessary, just walking to the golems will trigger the cutscene, but I gotta imagine there's been at least a few people who have thought their game bugged out, and they just quit out or something. Although I don't know what the game does then now that I think about it. I'd imagine it locks you in this room. The credits were about 7 minutes in 1.0, where there were about 9 minutes in current patch. This is because current patch includes credits for the Scar of the First Sin, despite being in vanilla. Whether that means it's for the DLCs or the overhauled version, I'm not sure. Perhaps both. But it does obviously pad out the credits a bit more. The current patch version even plays an additional, short song right after the normal longing track, called Remains. Where the 1.0 credits end when longing ends. And the final change I noticed for this game, the Scythe of Wong goes from C strength scaling to D, so a rare downscaling. Just so you know, I did also check the New Game Plus Old Soul weapons and spells, and didn't notice anything different. With the brief look I got into New Game Plus through the bonfire aesthetics, the New Game Plus experience seemed the same from the short bits I saw, but I didn't delve into it further than the Lowered Souls. If y'all are interested, perhaps it could be a short if I do actually find a few things, but I don't imagine it would warrant a full video. So yeah, that's all the changes I could find with a very thorough look at Dark Souls 2 Vanilla's 1.0 version. Unsurprisingly, the amount of changes to the actual gameplay that were very apparent were minimal, as we weren't quite at the point yet where games started abusing day 1 patches to finish the games to the same severity. Although I wouldn't have been surprised if there was more either, just because of how Dark Souls 2's initial builds are scrapped and started over from the beginning. As I said, Dark Souls 1 is coming next, hopefully within the month, and depending on whether we get Duskblood news and when, I may continue onward to Sekiro and the original Demon Souls after that. Modified Scholar Edition and perhaps Dark Souls Remastered overviews are tentative, depending on how much there is to talk about at all, since in a matter of speaking, they're already complete games compared to the original releases. Perhaps they could also be shorts or something. But for now, I do have Dark Souls 3, Elden Ring, Demon Souls Remake, Bloodborne, and Night Rain already up if you're interested in any of those. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you around. Take care.